All right, so here we have, why did the early English Baptists reject Paedobaptism, part 2. So again, we were talking, as you will recall, about the various sort of interlocking pieces that characterized some of the default assumptions that English people would have carried around regarding the universality of infant baptism. We talked a little bit about the Reformed rationale for infant baptism. We talked about how when the Reformation comes, at least amongst the magisterial reformers, they are keeping the practice of paedobaptism, but they are questioning, in fact rejecting the rationale that had undergirded paedobaptism for many centuries. So they have a new way of thinking about it, a new way of talking about it, and we talked about how that has certain other knock-on effects, because anytime we shift a piece of our theological puzzle, it's going to have effects and implications. So now we're going to kind of build on that further, and we're going to think a little bit more about how Congregationalists began to question the logic of that kind of strong Christendom, Constantinian national church idea, and that in doing so, they then create a context where the rejection of paedobaptism begins to appear more plausible to many and even sort of unavoidable to some. So that's our thought here. And to get into it, I thought it would be helpful to start with that was part of our recap. There we go. A little anecdote here from 1641. And we have the congregational minister Thomas Goodwin. And Thomas Goodwin, again, is a name that's come up in some of these talks, one of the leaders of English Congregationalism. And in 1641, he's delivering a series of sermons to his independent church in London. And he is expounding Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And he's doing it in characteristically meticulous detail. Goodwin had recently returned to England after a brief but formative period of religious exile in the Netherlands. And when he comes back and he starts to preach, his hearers were deeply moved by a preacher who was, as one contemporary described him, so blessed with a rich invention and a solid and exact judgment. And Goodwin took an unhurried approach to preaching, Ephesians. For Ephesians chapter 1, I know we have a fair number of preachers here, so think in your own mind, perhaps you've preached through Ephesians chapter 1. Imagine, how many sermons did I take to get through Ephesians chapter 1? I'd be interested to know. I preached through Ephesians, and I don't remember at all, actually, the number, but I know it was less than Goodwin. Goodwin took 36 sermons to get through Ephesians chapter 1. And what's interesting to me is, amidst this great abundance of subject matter, one issue in particular arrested his attention. It was actually during the penultimate sermon on Ephesians 1, sermon number 35. He paused to consider what he described as, quote, the great question of these times. Alternatively, the great controversy of these times. So again, this is Thomas Goodwin, congregational minister, 1641. And he says, this is the great controversy of our day. What did he have in view? And just to note, by middle of 1641, Goodwin's world was experiencing just a little bit of upheaval. I think that's fair to say. England had been invaded by Scottish Covenanters. The Archbishop of Canterbury had been arrested and imprisoned, and the king had been forced to call a parliament that he would be unable to dissolve. So there's a fair bit going on. And yet, for Goodwin, the great controversy turned not upon political or cultural convulsion, but rather upon what might have seemed to many a seemingly obscure point of ecclesiology. A question not often, I think, considered by too many modern historians, and even less perhaps fully appreciated. Goodwin says this: The great question of these times was whether, yea or no, many congregations, many churches, united in one, may not be called one particular church. So, what does this, at least to modern ears, at least to my modern ears, sort of strangely worded question mean for Goodwin? What did it mean for him? What did it mean for his hearers? And why did this influential Puritan minister, this member of the Westminster Assembly, deem this rather specific query to be the very hinge upon which the nation's future turned? What was going on? And interestingly, though the language of the great controversy perhaps sounds slightly odd to modern ears, he is in effect advocating in this sermon, and he's getting at it with this question, a congregational vision of ecclesiology. He's arguing for a believer's church, a church composed of visible saints admitted to membership on profession of faith, a congregation, a church limited to a local assembly. And he deemed this issue crucial, indeed vital, for the spiritual health of the nation. But where was he getting this? Where is he getting this vision and this idea? Where does this come from? Where did congregationalism, or the congregational way, as they might have called it, come from? And what were its most important tenets? Let's unpack that a little bit together. And if we want to think about spokesmen for the congregational way during the 1630s and 1640s, few voices were more authoritative than that of John Cotton. We've mentioned him before. Cotton was in the North American colony. He was invited to come over and participate directly in the Westminster Assembly, but he declined the offer. He preferred instead to influence events in England through a series of publications in which he explained the congregational vision to, among other people, an eager London audience, people like Thomas Goodwin. And one such treatise is called The Way of the Churches of Christ in New England, 1645. And it began by distilling the essence of Cotton's ecclesiology into a single statement. Let's look at that statement together. So Cotton writes, "The church which Christ in his gospel hath instituted, and to which he hath committed the keys of his kingdom, the power of binding and loosing, the tables and seals of the covenant, the officers and censures of his church, the administration of all his public worship and ordinances, is cotus fidelium, a communion of saints, a combination of faithful, godly men, meeting for that end by common and joint consent into one congregation, which is commonly called a particular visible church." So this passage is very interesting insofar as it contains within it arguably the two leading principles which gave congregationalism its distinctive shape. First, we see that the individual congregation is taken to be the exclusive New Testament expression of the institutionalized visible church. And so this is an assertion which implicitly negates the possibility of other ways of thinking about the church. Most importantly for our purposes, a comprehensive national church is negated because it's saying positively, this is what the New Testament thinks a church is. It is a individual congregation. And so if just one congregation is a particular visible church, and that's all the New Testament knows by that language, then a national church that comprises the entire nation, Cotton would argue, cannot properly be called a church at all. Second, this puts forward the idea that the members of each congregation are called to be visible saints. This is a word that they used quite a bit. And the idea is visible saints are those who are showing forth some fruit and some sort of credible evidence of spiritual transformation, regeneration, godliness. They're visible saints, men and women assembled by common and joint consent whose lives are giving outward evidence of having experienced an inward spiritual transformation. And if you think about those two ideas, and then you compare it with the Second London Baptist Confession, you'll see that the two correspond. So chapter 26, paragraph 2 of the Second London Confession, it uses the language of visible saints that was so important for folks like Cotton. It defines visible saints as those who are professing the faith of the gospel and manifesting obedience unto God. And of such visible saints, the confession says, our particular congregations are to be constituted. And paragraph 5 of chapter 26 says that visible saints are to walk together in particular societies or churches. So again, that vision, that ecclesiological vision, accords with this one. And this is interesting because with this statement here, again, we read this and the challenge for us is to kind of shed the sort of familiarity with this kind of talk, right? Because we think, oh yeah, visible churches, local church, members of the church have to give credible profession. This all seems very normal to us. At the time though, this was actually reversing a long-standing contemporary English norm in which individuals were assumed to be converted unless scandal or heterodoxy gave reason to doubt it. So in other words, you're in unless you show us why you ought to be out, as opposed to be in, you need to show us why you ought to be in. And so Congregationalists like Cotton here are regarding individuals as unconverted until they're able to offer some sort of evidence of saving grace, credible profession of faith, and a life that corresponds to that profession. And so taken together, these two principles constitute Congregationalism's vital center and really encapsulate that which is distinguishing it from the Presbyterian and Episcopalian alternatives. There are other things, of course, there's more that could be said, but I think this is kind of at the heartbeat of the distinction. Both Presbyterians and Episcopalians at this time, of course, continued on with the basic magisterial Reformation assumption that you should have a national church that comprehends the entire population. So this is where Congregationalism is sort of at. And the interesting thing, as we've said before, Congregationalists like John Cotton were Paedobaptists. What's interesting, though, is that in pursuing this sort of ecclesiological reform project that he outlines, they are actually going to incur a significant theological cost, namely, both of these central principles that Cotton is pushing to the forefront had an unintended consequence. Both of these, when taken together, begin to erode the logic upon which Cotton's Paedobaptism rested. Again, when we think about theology, we have to think about it in terms of it's a puzzle, it all fits together, and when you move one piece, there's going to be implications for other pieces. And so for someone like a John Cotton to embrace this new ecclesiological vision that departed in significant ways from that which his father or grandfather would have received, it cannot but have some sort of implication for other pieces of his theology. So the interesting thing for us is to think about what that might look like. And as Congregationalists pursued what they regarded as a purer form of the visible church, I would contend that the result at which they arrived was an inherently unstable arrangement, an unstable mixture, something that really was actually quite unprecedented among the heirs of the magisterial Reformation. So again, here we have, I'm going to need my magnifying glass. Jared, would you read what's in the blue box? Yes, okay, thank you. So basically what's going on is that one way of resolving the intrinsic tensions created by these theological innovations would have been to, of course, abandon the ecclesiology that underlied them. But another way would be to abandon not congregationalism, but Paedobaptism. And that, of course, is what we see happen. So here we have a situation in which the practice of Paedobaptism is affirmed and kept. Infant baptism is kept by Congregationalists, but this Reformed distinction between internal and external covenant membership is denied, with the result that you have a somewhat unstable theological mixture, something that sort of feels more and more shaky to an increasing number of folks. So, the theological tension, how Congregationalism undermined Paedobaptism. Again, twin pillars of Congregationalism. One, assertion that the individual congregation is the only New Testament expression of the visible church. And two, the requirement that all church members be visible saints. When you combine those two, it calls into question that basic Reformed distinction between internal and external members of the covenant community. And that is then a consequence of the congregational way of thinking about the church that in turn undermines the logic of Paedobaptism. So again, we saw this slide before, and as we discussed, the Paedobaptists' internal-external distinction is predicated upon the notion that God's covenant community was, by God's good design and intention in this life, always meant to include individuals who possessed only the outward sign of covenant membership, that is, baptism, while lacking any inward sign or inward corresponding saving faith. That's the whole idea, that you have these internal members, you have these external members, they're both valid members of the covenant community. And you can see this, how this changes, because Congregationalists come along and they begin to say, by insisting, no, church members have to be visible saints, they basically say this whole category of external membership in the covenant really doesn't exist. This is not a biblical category. The only covenant members are what folks like John Ball, the Presbyterian, have identified as these internal members. And you can see this in a fascinating document from the 1630s. So there's the congregational, there's sort of John Ball's vision. Congregationalists actually take away that distinction. Everybody is a visible saint. Okay. You can see this illustrated in a fascinating document from the 1630s. You have a group of Presbyterian ministers in England who send over a series of 32 questions to New England Congregationalists. Because again, they're separated by a great ocean, but there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of dialogue taking place, both through handwritten manuscripts sent back and forth and also published treatises. And the Presbyterians are curious and they're skeptical of what these New England ministers were doing. And when the New England Congregational ministers sent their replies back to the London Presbyterians, we actually get quite an interesting picture of what they're doing and what their vision is. And we see they were trying to more closely align the visible or outward external church with its invisible spiritual counterpart. They're trying to bring those two into conformity as closely as they can. So here's what they say at one point. They say, we do believe that all members of churches ought to be saints and faithful in Christ Jesus. And thereupon we count it our duty to use all lawful and convenient means whereby God may help us to discern whether those that offer themselves for church members be persons so qualified or no. And therefore, first we hear them speak concerning the gift and grace of justifying faith in their souls and the manner of God's dealing with them in working it in their hearts. So this approach, again, to church membership effectively denied the validity of that internal-external distinction. All ought to be saints and faithful. And so they say we count it our duty to discern whether they're qualified or no. And how do they do it? They want to hear them give an account of the gift and grace of justifying faith in their souls. They want to hear an account of the manner of God's dealing with them, working it in their hearts. This is how they were going to ensure, as best as they were able, that all those who they brought into the covenant community were in fact visible saints. Now, notice something, a crucial point, of course, is no one's arguing over whether in practice the visible church would contain unregenerate members. Everyone agrees that in practice the church will have both regenerate and unregenerate members. That is not at issue. No one would have disagreed then on that point, narrowly conceived, with the Scottish commissioners at the Westminster Assembly when they said that, quote, all visible churches which ever have been or shall be at any time on earth consist of persons good and bad, sheep and goats, wheat and tares, such as walk Christianly and such as walk inordinately. And in fact, again, Second London Confession, chapter 25, paragraph 3, agrees and says the purest churches under heaven are subject to mixture and error. So again, no one's saying in practice you won't have a mixed body. The question is that okay? Is that actually a part of God's design for the church? Is that desirable to have a mixed multitude? And should purity of membership even be an ideal towards which we're striving? That's the point at issue. Congregationalists argued that the New Testament church was not, in fact, by design, a mixed body. And so it's the duty of church officers to strive towards greater and greater purity, whereas their Presbyterian counterparts had a different vision. For the Congregationalists, by design, the church was intended to be composed of those who are inwardly holy, the pure and spotless bride of Christ, and that insofar as hypocrites were walking among the godly, well, then the latter, the godly, should make every effort to identify and extirpate the former. And during the early 17th century, the Congregationalists, the Dutch exile, the spiritual father to the Plymouth Pilgrims, John Robinson, he drafted a catechism that included the following exchange. So, question and answer format, of course. And he says, question, but are not hypocrites mingled with the faithful in the church? And his answer was, none ought to be by the word of God, and where such are, they are not truly added by the Lord in the church, but do creep in through their own hypocrisy, and not without the church's sin also, if they may be discerned to be such. So it's about the desirability of a mixed multitude. Congregations say, not desirable, not by design. Yes, in a fallen world, there will be hypocrisy, there will be false brothers. But it is our job as church officers to minimize that and to strive for a visible church that is composed of visible saints. So as Congregationalism developed and matured, its advocates remained constant in this conviction that this is what the visible church was intended to be, and that any imperfections were to be regarded as sad, unfortunate inevitabilities of life in a fallen world. Consider the description here offered by New England Congregationalist Thomas Shepard. Listen to what he says. He talks about the, quote, the diligent and narrow search trial churches here do or should make of all those whom they receive to be fellow members with them. He's preaching here during the late 1630s, and he explained that ideally the church, he said, quote, should receive in none but such as shall have communion with Christ at his coming. That is, elect saints who give evidence in this life of having experienced regeneration by the Holy Spirit. And again, he concedes such a project will never be executed perfectly, but the fact that this is not always practical should not discourage clergy from pressing towards the goal. And then listen to what he says here. He says, hence, if we could be so eagle-eyed as to discern them now that are hypocrites, we should exclude them now, as Christ will, meaning at his second coming. We should exclude them now, as Christ will, because they have no right. But that we cannot do. That we cannot do, the Lord will therefore do it for his churches. Yet, and again, that's sort of an eschatological vision there. And then he says, yet let the churches learn from this to do what they can for the Lord now. And that final exhortation really distills the disagreement between the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians at this point. All parties believe the church body in practice would contain a mixed multitude in this life because you have hypocrites creeping in. All agreed it would be divinely purified in the life to come, but it was the Congregationalists alone who felt obligated, quote, to do what they can for the Lord now. So, where does this go? Part 3, the structural revolution from national to local church. Closely bound up with this zeal for ecclesial purity was the congregational notion that the visible church ought to be understood exclusively in terms of particular congregations. So we were just talking about visible saints. Now let's talk about the other plank of Cotton's platform. Particular congregations are local gatherings, quote, as one source says, consisting only of so many as may and do meet together ordinarily in one place for the public worship of God and their edifying. So if you're defining the church as a gathering of those who can only ordinarily meet in one place for the public worship of God, that excludes any sense of the church as potentially larger than the local congregation. And this contrasted sharply with a Presbyterian vision, which could speak of the visible church in multiple senses. And this takes us back to what Thomas Goodwin was talking about when he talked about the great controversy of our day. That sense, can the word church mean multiple things, is what he's talking about. He says, our Presbyterian brethren hold the institution of church-state to fall upon the whole universal church as one great body by institution. Again, when he uses the word institution, he's using that in a sort of important technical sense. He's talking about they hold the institution of church-state to fall upon the whole universal church as one great body by institution. The single institution called the church, he says, was then amenable to the division and subdivision of the whole into several subordinations of greater and lesser bodies, each of which could be rightly termed the church. What's he talking about? The church, the division and subdivision of the whole into subordinations of greater and lesser bodies. So basically, if you think about it, a Presbyterian congregation is gathering for worship. That's the church gathered for worship. Representatives meet together at synod or general assembly. That is also the church meeting. That is the Presbyterian Church of America meeting together. That is the church, just as much as the local body is the church. It is, to use Goodwin's language, amenable to the division and subdivision of the whole into several subordinations of greater and lesser bodies. Combination, recombination. Goodwin likened this Presbyterian way of thinking about the church to a body of water, in which he said, this is all from this same sermon, he talked about every part of the water hath the nature of the whole. So every integral church, be it lesser or greater, national, provincial, congregational, etc., as they are all churches. So again, local church meeting, that's the church. Multiple congregations meet together, that's also a meeting of the church. It's all conceived of as the church. Goodwin is saying, actually, no, that's not the New Testament way of speaking. Another Presbyterian description of it from the time, this is the Scottish Presbyterian George Gillespie. He describes it like this. He says, the congregations in a nation are to be subject to a national assembly, in which many churches are combined into one, in the very same manner as many members are combined into one church. So here, Gillespie can speak of local congregations as properly churches in and of themselves, while simultaneously referring to a national assembly as also properly the church. But for the Congregationalists, the visible church is not scalable in this sense, right? If representatives of various church assemblies get together for some reason to talk about things of mutual interest, that is not a gathering of the church, that is a gathering of the churches. Simple, small distinction, but actually it kind of contains this whole world of ecclesiology behind it. And in so defining the visible church as a single local body, Congregationalists are thus denying the very possibility of a visible church organized along universal or national or regional lines. If you think about universal, you're thinking, what is that? Well, what is the Roman Catholic Church? It's one church comprehending, in their mind, the whole world and all true believers everywhere. You can think of a national church like the Church of England, comprehending all the believers in England. You can think of regional churches where all the churches, however you want to divide it, it's this geographic connection, and all the churches in the geographic entity, whether it's the whole world or a nation or a region, are all conceived of as constituting together the church. Congregationalists say no. So in other words then, what they're doing is repudiating not simply the Church of England as they found it, as in, we don't like this ceremony or this piece of the liturgy or whatever. They're denying the very idea of a comprehensive national church. And tracing this genealogy, along the congregational way is something that represented a far more radical position than did some of those English separatists like we looked at. This is the whole thing about Robert Brown, highly critical of the Church of England, says we need to leave it because at this point it's just not worth the effort anymore to try to reform it. It could be reformed in theory. If he became the grand poobah, he could tell them, okay, take that out, do away with that, etc. But I'm going to not waste my time with that anymore. Reformation without tarrying for any. Then we talked about Henry Jacob, who says, actually, you know what, I don't think national church is a good idea. So I can have great respect and great fellowship with individual churches of England, but the Church of England, in my mind, doesn't actually exist. That's the same vision here that's being pursued and put forward. Jacob wrote again, back to Henry Jacob. We talked about him already, but it's helpful maybe to revisit his words. He wrote in 1612 that, quote, Christ's true ministerial or visible church is but one ordinary congregation only, and therefore that Christ's true ministerial or visible church is not any diocesan or provincial church. Same idea. Repudiating the idea of a structure that goes beyond the local congregation. Jared, is that the quote I just read? I'm putting you on the spot. Never mind. Let's see. Let's just do that one. That one's fine. That doesn't have words in it. It'll be okay. Again, so what we see then is this movement. We see this movement towards separatism. That's that idea of independence. We see this stronger, sort of more fundamental undercutting with Henry Jacob in the national church. And then we see this same national church repudiation sort of embodied in the men and women that go across the ocean to North America, where they are able to pursue an ecclesiological experiment that they never could have pursued back in England. So this is where you see this interesting movement of ideas, and you see God in His providence actually using social and political, cultural circumstances to allow these folks to explore ecclesiology and put it into practice. And they were cognizant of this. They thought of what they were doing in going over to North America. They said, we've been presented with this sort of blank slate on which to write. One source wrote, seeing now God hath set before us an open door of liberty, they were able to do fundamentally different things. And that's what we see with the New England Congregationalists. John Cotton wrote, again, back to him, he wrote, "The whole nation of Israel," we saw this quote before, but we'll revisit it, "the whole nation of Israel made but one church, and the officers or ministers of any one synagogue, the priests and Levites, were ministers in common to the whole house of Israel." So again, note the parallel there. He's seen in the Old Testament this idea of a national church, national Israel. The priests are all sort of serving. But then he goes on, he says, "But this ecclesiastical arrangement that we see in the Old Testament," he says, "was intended to be temporary. So that," quote, "now, because the churches of the New Testament are of another constitution," i.e., not national. In fact, he goes on, he says, "None of them, they're of another constitution, none of them national, as the church of Israel was, but all of them congregational." So he's seen this shift. He's saying, yes, a national church actually resembles Old Testament Israel. That's not the vision in the New Testament, and we need to follow suit. And by forgoing an overarching national church structure, local congregations were freed from an obligation to include everybody living in the parish in the church. And instead, they're empowered to craft membership roles which reflected a purer form of Christian communion. This new approach admitted only visible saints, and it ended what Congregationalists described as the national church's penchant to promiscuously allow any and all into fellowship. One source says they promiscuously allowed all in, not excluding drunkards, whoremongers, profane swearers, covetous worldlings, atheists, papists, and the like. And this approach to church membership then, built on the voluntary association of the godly, was intrinsically inimical to a national church model in which everyone in practice was comprehended within the church body. So this is where the Congregationalists take it. But as we said, by so radically altering the nature of Christian communion, the New England Congregational ministers had also unwittingly undercut an institution that they had no desire to abandon, namely the baptism of infants. So let's talk about that. Part 4, Baptist solution, resolving the tension. Why did this happen? Why did they undercut this institution of infant baptism? Well, the Congregationalists, in certain key ecclesiological respects, narrowly conceived, were actually far closer on, again, certain points. They were closer to the continental Anabaptists than the magisterial reformers. That wasn't intentionally what they were trying to do. They weren't reading Anabaptist literature and saying, let's be like them. But actually, on certain points, that's where they end up. Listen to this description from the historian Scott Dixon, who observes that the 16th century Anabaptists, quote, explicitly rejected one of the main foundations of traditional Christian order, the unity of the Corpus Christianum, the body of Christ, created and confirmed through child baptism, and they replaced it with a form of baptism based on an individual and voluntary decision. Well, again, Congregationalists had no organic connection to the continental Anabaptists, no desire to have such a thing, and yet, with respect to this question of a comprehensive national church, they're kind of doing something quite similar to what Dixon describes. Congregationalists are defining the visible church exclusively in terms of local congregations composed of visible saints, and thus they're also exchanging a universal Constantinian Corpus Christianum in which the whole nation was included. They're trading that for a voluntary model of ecclesiastical identity. There's the Dixon quote, and you'll notice that language of the Corpus Christianum was language I believe Stephen Wolfe used in that quote I provided. So this is the situation the Congregationalists are in, and yet, unlike the continental Anabaptists, who made baptism the distinction, the point of distinction between the church and the world, Congregationalists continued to baptize infants and bring them into the church. And so rather than baptism, the Congregationalists made the local church covenant the point at which true Christians were identified and separated from the world. So in doing so, what are they doing? In a sense, Congregationalists are in effect de-emphasizing baptism. They're de-emphasizing baptism because they're baptizing infants, but then maintaining that membership in the church requires credible profession of faith, and so baptism becomes perhaps less important in congregational thought. Remember, shifting ideas are all often about emphasizing one thing more, emphasizing it less, emphasizing this at the expense of that. And we see something like that happening. To see an example of this, consider the New England Congregationalist Richard Mather. And someone challenged him by suggesting that congregational church covenants were needless because, quote, baptism makes men members of the visible church. In other words, why do you need to sign a church covenant to join the visible church if being baptized already made you a member of the visible church? Well, Mather responded to this criticism by attempting to distance baptism from entry into the visible church. He asserted that application of the sacrament, quote, neither makes the church nor members of the church, nor always so much as proves men to be members. So he's de-emphasizing baptism as the entryway into the visible church while continuing to baptize infants. And in so doing, again, we see the practice of infant baptism is remaining while certain foundational planks that used to uphold it are being called into question or rejected outright in this case. And the result is an unstable mixture. An unstable mixture that sat uneasily between those poles of the radical and magisterial Reformation. So by continuing to recognize infants of Christian parents as externally or federally holy, which they did continue to maintain, and baptizing them on that basis alone, Congregationalists perpetuated the internal-external distinction that their requirement of visible sainthood implicitly denied. And this created massive problems for Congregationalists during the 17th century. The difficulties inherent within this attempt to combine infant baptism with congregational ecclesiology are perhaps best illustrated by the so-called halfway covenant in New England. And this was quite interesting. It was a controversy that erupted in the 1650s, and it was in response to a problem that was arising amongst New England ministers. Namely, here's the problem they faced. So they have a godly couple, and this couple are members of the local church. Okay, godly couple has a baby. Now, according to Reformed theology, the congregational minister baptizes the baby of Christian parents. Okay, so far so good. However, then the baby grows up. After the baby is grown, the elders deem this adult to actually be unfit for membership. He can't provide the evidence of saving faith. He can't provide a credible profession of faith and a narrative of the Spirit's work in his life that the elders require, and so they don't want to allow him into full membership in the congregation. But then he has a baby of his own, and he and his wife want their baby to be baptized. So now you have a problem because you have baptized parents who want their infant baptized, but they're not deemed to be regenerate and thus not members of the church. So what do you do? Now, across the Atlantic, back in England, the Presbyterians and Episcopalians would not have had this problem because they would have baptized the baby. But Congregationalists are trying to uphold a believer's church. And so in the eyes of many contemporaries, to baptize the children of non-church members was to betray the basic congregational axiom that the church's sacramental life must be restricted to visible saints. And yet, at the same time, to not baptize these children would put the New England clergy in the awkward position of having to deny baptism to the children of parents who were baptized themselves and not living scandalously, a stance which would put them at variance with the Reformed tradition to which they claimed to belong. So there was a big problem and a big controversy. And the answer that they settled on, the so-called halfway covenant, created a sort of in-between status for people like this. They could have their children baptized by the minister, but could not receive communion. Halfway. And this halfway covenant highlighted the inherent ambiguities of a system that insisted on visible sainthood as the defining mark of Christian identity, while also baptizing infants who could not possibly evidence the requisite signs of grace. An inherently unstable mixture. And unsurprisingly, this halfway covenant system, which produced a result that was unprecedented in the history of all Christianity, led to great problems. John Allen, New England Congregationalist minister, commented in 1662. He said that this controversy, the halfway covenant business, he says, gave great advantage to who? The anti-Paedobaptists, which, if we be silent, will tend much to their encouragement and increase. So in other words, he's seeing, hey, people are looking, anti-Paedobaptists, a word he's using for Baptists, are looking at this and they're pointing out, hey, this is kind of a weird situation that you all are in. Actually, there's a simpler way to do things. Just don't baptize these infants in the first place and you won't have these problems. And he says, yeah, this is giving great advantage to the anti-Paedobaptists. So again, why is that? It's because there's an inherent instability in this mixture of two things that actually don't sit well together, congregational ecclesiology and Paedobaptism. And they're seeing that happen. All of this is arising because the baptismal practices of congregational ministers are reinforcing a distinction between internal and external covenant membership, which their church membership practices are trying to formally eliminate. It doesn't work especially well. So, to summarize then, Paedobaptist congregational theology contained this fundamental tension. It affirmed with the Westminster Directory of Public Worship that children were by baptism received into the bosom of the visible church, while at the same time stressing the seemingly contradictory notion that visible saints only are fit matter appointed by God to make up a visible church of Christ. That, by the way, is a quote from Congregationalist Thomas Hooker in his survey of the sum of church discipline, 1648. They're affirming things that don't seem to fit easily together. So while their primary burden then was to ensure church membership rolls composed of men and women who had evidenced Christian conversion, they undercut that mission by continuing to include within the church baptized infants capable, or rather incapable, of meeting the same standard. So then, what we've been trying to do is outline this constellation of ecclesiological ideas which animated the congregational movement on both sides of the Atlantic, a theological constellation that we can identify as the believer's church. And congregational innovators like Henry Jacob, John Cotton, were driven by a desire to define the visible church in terms of local congregations filled with visible saints. And so they formulated a new voluntaristic approach to ecclesiology, repudiating a 1,200-year-old Constantinian consensus. And this then is the context, it's working within this set of ideas that London Congregationalists associated with Henry Jesse's Southwark Church and that circle of folks began to question Paedobaptism during the late 1630s. This is the context in which they're thinking. And it's not necessarily that this congregational ecclesiology made it sort of a necessary requirement to abandon Paedobaptism. Clearly, most Congregationalists did not. And yet I would argue that these inherent tensions and contradictions made Paedobaptism much more plausible than it otherwise had been. And then all the other arguments start rushing into one's mind. The silence of the New Testament, rethinking federal theology, various ways in which we could argue for this. So we're returning then to this central puzzle with which we began. Why did the signatories of the 1644 First London Baptist Confession why did they reject paedobaptism when they did? Again, it's true they couldn't find paedobaptism in their Bibles, but there was more to it. When we read their writings and we read them with this congregational background in view, we find that questions about church membership, questions about the believer's church, this is consistently and strikingly reflected throughout their published writings. And it helps, I think, explain why this became plausible intellectually when it did. So like their Paedobaptist congregational contemporaries, those who were rejecting paedobaptism lamented the great number of people included in the parish church structures of England who never gave any evidence of genuine saving faith. And as Congregationalists, they believed that the solution to this problem was to reinstitute the New Testament model of ecclesiastical governance, a model in which, as the 1644 First London Confession would put it, the church, as it is visible to us, is a company of visible saints. So you see that visible saints congregational language in the First London Confession as well. Called and separated from the world by the word and spirit to the visible profession of the faith of the gospel. And yet, as they sought to further perfect and reform the congregational project, many within this circle of London Congregationalists pressed the logic of the polity further. For if the only fit members of a visible church were visible saints, and baptism was the door through which entrance into the visible church must pass, why then should that door be opened to infants who cannot possibly offer the requisite evidence of saving faith? If, as Congregationalists insisted, internally regenerate saints were never intended to mingle alongside unconverted hypocrites within the visible church of the New Testament, then why should congregational churches continue a practice of paedobaptism that both reinforced and itself was undergirded by the very two-tiered internal-external approach to the covenant and covenantal membership which they formally repudiated? So during the late 1630s and 1640s, again, London Congregationalism produced a new movement of Baptistic Congregationalists, a new movement of Baptistic Congregationalists who understood their rejection of paedobaptism as a natural extension of the congregational principles to which they were already committed. Treatises published by particular Baptists during the 1640s exhibited a strong sense of concern for the purity of the visible church. And their authors clearly understood infant baptism as the decisive mechanism through which that purity was compromised. We see many examples of this in their writings. They talked about how by indiscriminately bringing children into the fold of the visible church without knowledge of their future spiritual estate, ministers who baptized infants surely were welcoming many who would never go on to profess faith. And again, if your ecclesiological vision includes a comprehensive national church that includes everybody by design, the regenerate, the unregenerate, everybody, that's not really a problem. You baptize them all in, they're all in, whether externally or internally, it's all fine. If they act too badly or openly blaspheme or something, in theory, you could kick them out. But assuming they just carry on, it's all good. But the congregational way insisted on voluntaristic rather than comprehensive membership. And so it's with such concerns in mind that particular Baptists began to write and warn about ways in which infant baptism, quote, enforceth such matter upon the church, talking about unregenerate members, as tends to the destruction of the form of it. In other words, they're saying that the national church is bringing in all these people into the church who don't belong there, and it actually spoils it. Particular Baptists like Samuel Richardson were quick to point out that infant baptism, he wrote, tends to a national church and, quote, upholds a national church, as circumcision did of old. In other words, circumcision in the Old Testament given to all of Israel, or to all the males, this upholds this idea of a national church, and likewise paedobaptism upholds the idea of a national church. Paul Hobson complained, another particular Baptist, quote, the baptizing of infants makes them members of their church before they are called of God. Francis Cornwell argued that the widespread, quote, baptism of the infants of believers, he said, was directly responsible for, quote, establishing national churches and overthrowing the particular churches of Jesus Christ. Most vividly, William Kiffin said that he compared the national church's comprehensive intake of any and all to a gluttonous natural body. And he said that though this body was, quote, greedy to receive it all, it lacked, quote, power to void the excrements and, quote, must needs become a rotten, filthy, and unclean body. It's a vivid image, perhaps not one I would use from the pulpit, but 17th century folks did things differently. And you can see the vehemence with which he regarded infant baptism as this vehicle promoting the corruption of the church. The church is meant to be composed of visible saints. We're bringing in all of these people who do not necessarily profess faith. We have no way to get them out, and it all has to change. But notice how they rhetorically tie infant baptism to the idea of a national church. One more. This is one that brings many connections between congregationalism and believers' baptism together nicely, I think. This is Christopher Blackwood's 1644 treatise, The Storming of Antichrist. And when Blackwood rejected Paedobaptism, he was a rector in Staplehurst in Kent, and he was also connected to the Jesse Circle, having served from 1640 to 1642 as minister of the Congregational Church in Skiskatchewan in the Plymouth colony, a church long pastored by Jesse's predecessor at Southwark, John Lathrop. So, despite Blackwood's ministry within the Church of England, his ecclesiological vision was decidedly congregational. And it's a fact which is evident on this treatise that he wrote on baptism. So in describing the visible church, Blackwood gives the standard congregational definition of a particular church as, quote, a company of saints in profession, explicitly or implicitly consenting together. And of first importance, he says, to the church's composition is that it be composed of a right matter, namely visible saints. And on this point, Blackwood notes that we are beholding for recovery of this truth, to our brethren, nicknamed independents, which is as precious a truth about church order as ever was recovered from the spoils of Antichrist. And crucially, Blackwood connects this emphasis on visible saints with the dangers of baptizing infants into a comprehensive national church. And he accuses the magisterial reformers, Luther and Calvin, etc., of having erred on this point. Look how he says it. He said, their mistake in the matter of the church, meaning Luther, Calvin, magisterial reformers, for so many hundreds years, taking mixed multitudes for the matter thereof, the matter of the church, when the Scripture makes saints in profession the matter thereof. Baptism, being appointed of Christ, for differencing the matter of the church from all other societies, surely a right baptism failing, in respect of the subject, a right matter must needs fail. These two errors, like Hippocrates' twins, were born at the same time and will die together. Again, the language gets somewhat convoluted there, but essentially the two errors that are born together and will die together are the error of the national church and the error of paedobaptism. He links them, he says they're intimately connected, one reinforces the other, and they'll live together, they'll die together. He wants to get rid of both of them. There's more we could say about that. There's many more examples in the book, in Orthodox Radicals. I collect more and similar kinds of evidences. But let me now just conclude this session together, just thinking a little bit about an application point for today. I think all of church history has application for today. And when I think about this subject, it can seem rather distant and remote, perhaps, from many of the concerns with which we wrestle on a daily basis. And yet, I think these reflections should, if we're credo Baptists by conviction, I think some of these historical reflections should actually really affirm us in our doctrine of believers' baptism. And I think that as Reformed Baptists, sometimes we struggle, maybe more than other folks, with this issue and this issue of Paedobaptism. And I think part of the problem is if you're a Reformed Baptist, in all likelihood, many of the people that you read and enjoyed and continue to read and are nourished by in your faith, many, if not most of them, are Paedobaptist by conviction. You know, I've got my Banner of Truth tie on, and I own many Banner of Truth books, and I haven't done the math, but I would assume that a very high percentage are Paedobaptist. And that's a strange thing, because you think, okay, well, what am I missing? These people are guiding me so faithfully on all these aspects of Christian life and practice, and yet on this big thing, I just don't see where they're coming from. And that can maybe be discouraging or confusing. To me, these sort of historical reflections help on that point. Why? Well, because I think they show that the question of Paedobaptism was actually quite tightly connected to other issues related to ecclesiology, issues related to a national church. And actually, on the national church point, that is something that all of us, Credo-Baptist and Paedobaptist in the main, have essentially set to one side as not a New Testament vision. I know there are people who might disagree. We had the quote from Stephen Wolfe up on the screen. However, in the main, most of our Presbyterian brothers and sisters are not pushing for a strong, comprehensive Constantinian national church. And so for me anyway, when I see, okay, actually there were a lot of historically rooted reasons why Paedobaptism seemed so plausible, so inevitable, so a part of the warp and woof of our vision of the Christian life at one time. And actually those historical concerns have essentially faded away on at least the point of the church as voluntary association of believers as opposed to comprehensive, compelled by force, go to church or you're going to get fined vision. We're all Congregationalists now in the main, with very few exceptions. Again, so when I think about that, to me, that's an encouragement. And so I look at my John Calvin and my other sources that have so nourished my own faith, all these Puritans, the vast majority of Puritans in my Puritan paperback collection, in fact, maybe all of them in the Puritan paperback collection, were Paedobaptists. And so I'm encouraged to know, actually, I think there were historical reasons for this, and I think there were historical shifts that made Credo-Baptism plausible. And I think the more we understand them, the more we can be affirmed in our own profession today. So I hope this has been something of an encouragement to you. Thank you very much for your attention to all the sessions I brought today, and look forward to Jared closing out the evening. Thank you very much.